Econ friends, welcome back to our next video. In this one, we'll be covering externalities, the first and usually the biggest, the most important of the four market failures. Let's first start with a definition. An externality, which is also known as a third-party effect, which is also known as a spillover. So externalities, aka spillovers, aka third-party effects, they arise whenever the market transactions of a consumer or a firm, in other words, whenever the voluntary transactions between a buyer and the seller cause some other party who is not involved in the transaction to either benefit or be harmed. So think about a market as being a bubble. And within that bubble, buyers and sellers are making voluntary trades. Up until now, we've conceptualized that that bubble is kind of self-contained and that what buyers and sellers do makes each of them better off, but the bubble kept the transaction intact. You can think of a spillover, an externality, a third-party effect as being when the actions don't stay in the bubble, but instead when the actions of the buyers and sellers spill out of that bubble and cause either benefit or harm to a third party, an external person who was not involved in the original transaction. When we're talking about externalities, we can classify them as either positive or negative externalities. So a negative externality, which is also known as an external cost, occurs when somebody who is not involved in the transaction is harmed by the transaction. What's an example of this? Well, the most common example given in books is like pollution. Let's say that there's a factory that's manufacturing steel, so there's a market for steel. The manufacturing facility, they're making it. Some manufacturers and other people are buying it, so there's a market for steel, this steel bubble. Well, if we think through it and we find that the production of steel causes lots of pollution, and that pollution decreases air quality, for example, maybe that pollution causes a small percentage of young children to get asthma or some other kind of breathing difficulty. That would be a negative externality, because the young children, for example, that get asthma, or even the community as a whole that has to suffer with really bad air quality, they were not part of the bubble, of the market for the manufacture or consumption of steel. Yet, even though they're external, they have to pay the price, or they have to pay a price. So that's a negative externality, an external cost, which occurs when there is some harm done to a third party who was not involved in a transaction. On the other hand, there is also a situation known as a positive externality. As the name suggests, a positive externality is an external benefit. With a positive externality, somebody who is external to the transaction gets benefits. So somebody is going to benefit from a transaction in which they were not directly involved. What might be an example of a positive externality? Let's take, for example, public education. Suppose that a person has no children, yet they still have to pay significant property taxes or other taxes to support local K-12 education. That person might say, why am I having to pay these taxes? I don't have children. I'm not going to have to pay for anybody to go to school. Yet we believe that if the overall society is more educated, if we have a more informed, more articulate citizenry, then everybody benefits. So even a person who is not directly involved in the market for sending children to K-12 education is going to get some kind of benefit. That benefit being they are part of a better society. And maybe in the long run, they're going to be part of a more economically stronger society. So even though they're not directly involved in the market for K-12 education, because they're not sending any kids through it, they benefit. You can also consider, especially now, given pandemic times, that inoculations, for example, or vaccines might be a positive externality. Imagine a situation where there's 100 people, 99 of them choose to get a vaccination. One person doesn't. That one person is not part of the vaccine market because they're neither buying nor producing a vaccine. But if 99 people get vaccinated, that one person can't get sick. So they are generating, they're receiving a benefit that they did not pay for. Okay, so that will be called a positive externality. These can be very tricky. So to understand externalities, what I encourage you to do is to focus on the difference between private costs and social costs, and between private benefits and social benefits. And then in turn, between the outcomes of a market equilibrium and what we would call the socially efficient equilibrium. So again, the best way to think through externalities is to compare and contrast. What are we comparing and contrasting? Well, we're comparing and contrasting the private costs, which are the costs that a manufacturer has to take on, a supplier has to take on, versus the social costs, which go to society as a whole. And we're going to compare and contrast private benefits, which are the benefits that a buyer gets when he or she buys a product, to the social benefits, which are the benefits that all society gets, even if people don't buy the product. And when we put these together, what we're ultimately going to be doing is seeing and measuring a gap between what the market equilibrium is and what the socially efficient equilibrium is. Okay, let's break these down into some separate pieces, explain them a little bit, and then we'll map them out in a traditional supply demand graph and it'll make some sense. Okay, number one, we have an idea of marginal private cost. We can define marginal private cost, or MPC, as the costs of production that are borne by sellers when they manufacture an item. We've already discussed this. We know that in the production process, producers, right, sellers, they have to use land and labor and capital. They have to pay to get land and labor and capital and transform that land, labor, capital into a finished good or service. Marginal private costs are simply the costs that a manufacturer has to pay to make a product. And even though we haven't explicitly said it, we've already seen this, because marginal private costs are basically the supply curve. When we see a supply curve in a traditional supply demand model, that supply curve is effectively representing the marginal cost of production to the supplier. So this idea of marginal private cost, don't overthink it. You already are familiar with it. It's what a seller has to pay to get all the resources that he or she needs to transform stuff into a product and sell it. We've already discussed it. That's the supply curve. What's new is what we're going to call marginal social cost, MSC. The marginal social cost is going to equal the private cost plus any additional external costs that are produced via production. Let's go back to our example of a steel manufacturer. Suppose that a steel manufacturer has to buy all these raw materials, land, labor, and capital, and convert those into the steel that they're going to sell. Well, the steel supply curve is going to represent the marginal private cost, all the land, labor, capital. But let's suppose that steel production is going to generate some bad air quality for a community, and that a handful of people every year are going to get sick because of that air quality. They're going to have some respiratory issues. Kids might develop asthma. Old people might have trouble breathing. These are external, additional costs. They're not borne by the steel manufacturer. They're borne by society, and this makes them social costs. So when we talk about marginal social costs, we're going to be talking about the private costs plus any additional external costs. Now, these external costs can be very difficult to measure. It's very easy to measure private costs. How much did you pay for the raw materials? How much did you pay for the labor? How much did you pay for your energy? How much did you pay for your shipping? That's pretty easy. Social costs are a little trickier. I mean, how do you measure the cost of asthma? How do you measure the cost of bad air? How do you measure the cost of congestion? So measuring these external costs, it's going to be difficult. Suffice to say that when you do your analysis, you just consider them as costs, not from the perspective of the individual firm, but from the perspective of society. Okay. Now we go from the cost side to the benefit side. Marginal private benefits, also known as MPB, marginal private benefits. Those are the benefits that are received by people who purchase a product. Marginal private benefits are the benefits that go to private people who purchase an item. You already know this one too, because at the end of it, this is simply the demand curve. The demand curve represents all the benefits that accrue to the people who are willing and able to buy a product. So nothing new here. We haven't explicitly said it, but you get this idea that marginal private benefits, MPB, it's just a demand curve, so it's nothing new, okay? However, we get into marginal social benefit. This is new. Marginal social benefit is going to equal the private benefit plus any additional external benefits. Suppose that a handful of people go and pay for a vaccination, pay for an immunization. Well, the marginal private benefit is going to be the benefit that they receive, the immunity, from paying for it. However, as we established a minute ago, if a handful of people choose to get immunized and to pay for a vaccine or an immunization, there's going to be other people who don't get vaccinated who now have a far lower chance of getting sick. So they're going to accrue a benefit even though they didn't buy the product. This is an external benefit. And when you add together the private benefit plus the external benefit, you're going to get the marginal social benefit. Okay, so note that right now what we've done is we've taken the idea of cost and benefit, which is nothing new to us, but we've sort of separated it to get us thinking about private cost versus social cost and the gap between them, private benefit and social benefit and the gap between them. We can put all this together in a typical supply and demand analysis, and we've already done that. We know from before that in supply and demand, we have demand, we have supply, and we have critically an equilibrium. Okay, nothing new. Let's put this into the terms of externality language. Market equilibrium. Market equilibrium, what we're showing right here, this occurs where supply meets demand, which we know. But to be really clear, the supply is equal to the marginal private cost and the demand is equal to the marginal private benefit. And this right here is market equilibrium. And of course, we have the market equilibrium price and the market equilibrium output level. Okay, nothing new here. We know supply and demand. All we're doing here is putting the language of marginal private cost and marginal private benefit onto our supply and demand curves. Okay, so market equilibrium occurs where supply equals demand. We see it here. However, the socially efficient equilibrium as opposed to the market equilibrium. The socially efficient equilibrium occurs where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. So what we have now is this. Again, to contrast, up here, we had market equilibrium. Market equilibrium occurring where the supply curve meets the demand curve, where the marginal private benefit equals the marginal private cost. Now we're going to contrast that with what we see here in this graph. And this is the socially efficient equilibrium. And the social equilibrium occurs where the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit. Okay? Note that we're distinguishing socially efficient equilibrium from market equilibrium. And that gap is going to be critical to you understanding market failure. Okay? So again, we have a social equilibrium, and critically, from this social equilibrium point, we can derive the quantity of output that is socially optimal. What we're going to find, my friends, in short, that whenever there's a market failure, the market's going to not produce the socially optimal amount of the thing in question. It will either overproduce or underproduce. Okay? So again, when there's a market failure, there's going to be a gap between the market equilibrium and between the socially efficient outcome. When you have a negative externality, we're going to argue that there's going to be an overproduction of the bad thing, while if there's a positive externality, there's going to be an underproduction of the good thing. Okay? So again, we have a gap now. We're building a model where we're going to see a gap between what the social equilibrium and the market equilibrium is. And when we put it all together, we can see it right here. Let's take a look first at panel A, a negative externality. Notice first market equilibrium, which they call private equilibrium. And market equilibrium, private equilibrium, occurs where supply equals demand, where the marginal private cost equals the marginal private benefit. So we have here a private equilibrium. At this point, we drop down and we get the amount that is going to be produced in the market. We could also go across and get the market price. But we're going to contrast that with the social equilibrium, the socially efficient equilibrium. And this occurs where the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit. Notice that what we have here is a gap. It's like we have two supply curves. We have the market supply and the marginal social, the socially efficient supply. Notice that the gap between those two curves represents the negative externality. So you can see the negative externality, the size of that negative externality, as being a gap between the market supply curve and the marginal social cost curve. When we put it all together, here's what it comes down to. We have a social equilibrium, and if we drop a line down, you can see that we have an output level here called Q social, that is the socially efficient equilibrium. And it's very clear under the typical analysis, when you have a negative externality, the market is producing right here, but society really only wants down here. And as a result, we conclude that in the case of a negative externality, the market overproduces. There's too much pollution. There's too much of these bad things because the mechanics of supply and demand send the wrong signals. Okay, notice also that if we were to go across here, we can see that there's also a price that's the socially efficient price. And we'll call this the market price. We learned a while back that prices send signals and that prices are important. So we can also look at a negative externality that the market charges too little, that the market price is wrong. And since the price is wrong, the allocations are wrong. Okay, so to conclude it, in a negative externality, the market charges a price that's too low and consequently produces an amount that's too high. We can see the opposite in the case of a positive externality, an external benefit. Notice that because we're talking here about benefits and its buyers, the two different curves are on the demand side. We have the marginal private benefit, which is the regular demand curve, and the marginal social benefit, which is the socially efficient demand curve. And you get the idea here. We're going to have a market equilibrium here called private equilibrium, where the supply and the demand curves meet. And that's going to give us a private outcome. Q private is what the market itself will produce. However, given this gap here, this positive externality between what the market produces and what society wants, we have social equilibrium. We drop a line down and we get the quantity that is socially optimal. So we're going to conclude that for a positive externality, the market underproduces. The market might overproduce pollution as a negative externality, but the market underproduces, for example, vaccinations. The market, if left alone, will underproduce neonatal care, prenatal care that allows newborns to become, bigger and stronger and have more economic long-term potential. There's a lot of times, these are the market failures, when what the market generates is not what society wants. To summarize this, there's a gap between market equilibrium and socially efficient equilibrium. That gap implies inefficient allocations and inefficient production levels. In the case of a negative externality, the market will produce too much of the bad thing. And in a positive externality, the market will not produce enough of it. That is the breakdown graphically of how externalities are treated. This then leads to a really important question, and this is where we typically drift from economics into political economy, and we get into those normative questions of, okay, if there is a problem, if there is a market failure, how do we fix it? We argue that externalities can be addressed in broadly two ways. Externalities can be addressed via government action, typically government rules and laws and regulations, or in some cases by private market-based solutions. And I know that it sounds kind of ironic that a market-based solution could actually solve a market failure, but there are cases where that could happen. And there's been some pretty good successes, especially when it comes to, for example, cap and trade policies that allow a market for pollution permits in bringing down overall pollution levels in our country, okay? But there's two broad ways that we can do it. The first broad way is with government policies. Government policies, there's a couple of things that the government can do. One common governmental policy or one common governmental response to an externality is what we're going to call command and control regulation. Okay, so one government policy is command and control regulations. With this, the government directly inserts itself into the economy and they pass laws directly regulating how much businesses can actually sell. So they will set limits on the amount of the externality that can be produced. So you can imagine a situation where pollution is an externality, maybe in the steel market. The government, if they were going to follow a command and control regulation, would pass laws that basically tell each steel manufacturer the limit of how much pollution they can produce. And if they produce above that amount, they're breaking federal government regulations and they're going to face some sort of penalty, maybe criminal, maybe civil, maybe a fine. Okay. But again, we have this idea of government policies that are regulatory in nature, legal in nature. The government can also use corrective taxes. Make that cleaner for you. Corrective taxes and subsidies as a way to address equilibrium, as a way to address the gap between market equilibrium and socially efficient. So a second governmental tool is the use of corrective taxes and corrective subsidies. Whenever you have this, what the government's trying to do is align the socially efficient equilibrium and the market equilibrium. In other words, they're trying to eliminate that gap and align what the market produces with what people want. Okay. When it comes to a corrective tax, which we can call a Pigovian tax, a corrective tax is a tax that the government levies on any activities that produce a negative externality. You know from our supply discussion that taxes raise the cost of production, and that therefore taxes have a predictable impact on the supply curve and on the supply decisions. When the government passes a corrective tax, what they're trying to do is increase the price of doing business in an effort to get producers to consider their negative externality in their decision making. Okay. Seen a different way, if you have a tax, you're going to shift the supply curve up. Okay. Corrective taxes will shift the marginal private cost by the amount of the tax. So take a look here. In a perfect world, it would look something like this. We start off with the marginal private cost, which is the supply curve. And obviously then we would have a market equilibrium. We know though that the market equilibrium is not the social equilibrium. But if the government realizes, wait a minute, a tax increases the cost of production, if they pass a corrective tax, they're basically looking to shift the supply curve to the left. And if they are able to make the tax amount equal to the externality amount, eventually they'll get to a point where the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost are equal. And therefore the social equilibrium will be equal to the market equilibrium, and therefore the market will produce the right amount. Now, that sounds really good, but it's very difficult in practice because it is almost impossible to judge not only the amount of harm being done in a negative externality, but remember, economics and economic decisions have side effects. Oftentimes, when policymakers want to pass these corrective taxes, they neglect some of the side effects of the taxes. And as you know now from our earlier discussions, when you don't think through those potential side effects, you might create what we call perverse incentives that, while fixing one problem, might create another problem. But at least conceptually, that is another governmental tool, a corrective tax, a Pigovian tax to try to align the MPC and the MSC. Now, in the case of a positive externality, the government can utilize what is known as a corrective subsidy. A corrective subsidy is a subsidy on an activity that generates a positive externality. Note that you can also use a corrective subsidy to benefit or incentivize an activity that creates a smaller negative. externality. Let's take a typical example when it comes to environmental economics, the burning of coal. Okay, burning coal is a primary source of energy and electricity for us today, so we rely on it. The burning of coal, however, also causes pollution, lower air quality, so clearly the burning of coal has a negative externality. Sometimes the government can tax coal producers. They can say, hey, we're going to set a corrective tax, a Pigovian tax, in the amount of your pollution to try to align the curves and eliminate the problem. However, the government could also offer a corrective subsidy. Maybe they could offer a subsidy to wind or to solar energy manufacturers. By doing that, they're incentivizing an activity that has a smaller negative externality. You can also see the government in the case of education. You have free education at the K-12 level. They're subsidizing a positive externality because they believe that if we have a broad, well-planned educational system, society as a whole benefits. Okay, so again, a corrective subsidy is either going to subsidize a positive externality to get more of it, like education, or subsidize an activity that minimizes a negative activity, like favoring wind and solar through subsidies as opposed to coal, who they would tax. Okay. Note that at the end, the goal in the case of a positive externality is the same as the goal in a negative, and that is alignment. These corrective subsidies are seeking to align market equilibrium and socially efficient equilibrium. In this case, by incentivizing producers to consider externalities in their decision making. So we've now covered the first broad approach to externalities, government interaction, either through straight command and control regulatory approaches or through corrective tax and subsidy approaches. But there's also a form, and this is relatively new, somewhat controversial, and not always applicable, but still fascinating. There's also a place for private market-based solutions as a way to solve market failures. And again, I know that sounds really odd. It's kind of a paradox. You think, wait a minute, if we have a market failure, how can a market solution fix it? But there are some cases when that can happen. These cases were first outlined, and these kind of rules were first outlined by an economist named Ronald Coase. And therefore, when we talk about private solutions to market failures, we often are referencing what's called the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem offers a non-regulatory approach to solving externality problems. What does the Coase theorem say? Well, it says this. The Coase theorem says that if property rights are established and if transaction costs are low, these are two major criteria: the establishment of property rights and very, very low, almost near zero transaction costs. If those are in place, then private individuals should be able to negotiate an efficient solution to an externality issue. How does this work? Let's say you have a roommate. Let's say that you want to get to sleep early, but your roommate wants to play music. Okay. If your roommate wants to play music, but you want to sleep, there's a problem. Negative externality. Suppose that you valued sleep at $100. I apologize. I just lost my my screen share. We'll get through the rest of this and I'll start up again. Suppose that you and your roommate have this issue. Your roommate wants to play music at night, but you want to sleep. Well, suppose that you value sleep at $50 and your roommate values the music at $70. Well, that's not going to work. But suppose that you value sleep at $50 and your roommate values music at $20. In other words, you would pay $50 to have quiet, your roommate would accept 20 to turn the music off. In that situation, there's a chance for arbitrage, for negotiation. You would say to your roommate, hey, listen, you want music, I want to sleep. If I pay you $35, will you turn the music off? And your roommate would, because they only value the music at $20. So now you're paying less than you value. He or she is getting more than they value. Now, this might not make you happy. You may still think that's inherently unfair that you have to pay to sleep. But the issue from the lens of the Coase theorem is that you did not need some sort of government interference to solve this problem. The presence of property rights and small transaction costs allow you and your roommate to engage in a mutually beneficial negotiation, okay? Note the importance of property rights as a condition of the Coase theorem. If your roommate did not own the rights to turn that music on or off, then you can't make the deal with them. So property rights are critical. Equally critical are transaction costs. Transaction costs, those refer to the cost of negotiations. I know that you guys can't see the screen share. I'm just going to wrap this up real quick and then we'll reboot it. But the transaction costs, which are the costs and the expenses related to negotiations, they're very complex. And they're typically harder to measure as more and more people are affected by an externality. So we're going to say that transaction costs are complex, and that these transaction costs will say they typically increase as more and more people are involved in a transaction. Take, for example, air pollution. In a case of air pollution, where the polluters and the victims are widely distributed all over a broad geographic area, high transaction costs. Also note the problem that when it comes to pollution, nobody owns the air. So there's a property right issue. And therefore, when it comes to pollution, we're probably not going to have private solutions and the government has to regulate. But under the Coase theorem, whenever property rights are intact and transaction costs are low, there can be a market solution to a market failure. Okay? So that, my friends, is the most confusing and the most detailed and in-depth of our 4 failures, externalities. By way of a brief recap, externalities are spillover effects. They can be positive if there's an external benefit, or negative if there's an external cost. When we're going to map out and analyze these, we're going to distinguish between private benefit and social benefit, and private cost and social cost. And on a graph, we're going to see 2 different equilibrium: the socially efficient equilibrium and the market equilibrium. The gap between those 2 is going to be the externality. In a negative externality, the market, left alone, will overproduce the bad thing, like pollution. With a positive externality, if left alone, the market will underproduce the good thing, like vaccinations and prenatal care for babies. Okay? To solve these problems, we have either governmental policies, command and control regulations, or tax and subsidy regulations, or private solutions in those cases where the Coase theorem can hold. Okay? Thanks for your time. See you next video.